My recent trip to Jerusalem really got me thinking about the biblical stories I learned as a kid, many of which I still cherish deeply. While Israel is technically foreign to me relative to my home here in Texas, it felt familiar, like I have some kind of roots there myself. Given my upbringing, I think this is understandable. Being taught biblical stories early in my childhood is one of the ways I learned about morality. Later, as an adolescent, biblical wisdom literature helped me learn more complex values. I've learned to think more complexly and independently from it as I've grown up, but this literature is still important to me. When I stopped believing in God several years ago, I wanted to distance myself from Christianity and find myself apart from its influence. I'm glad that I did that, as it was the right thing for me to do at the time. I'm at a point now, though, where I have control over my own life, and the socially enforced Christianity I knew in my youth is really no longer a threat to my autonomy. I can now engage with Christian ideas without having them forced on me or associating them primarily with Christians who have used scripture to abusively control me. Now that I'm in this state, I've found studying the Bible critically to be one of my favorite pastimes. Through this study, I've realized that, surprisingly, I still find myself rather enamored by many of the biblical ideas I learned as a child. Allow me to discuss a moral issue I've dealt with to show you what I mean. This YouTube channel that you're watching right now is my full-time job and has been for about 4 years now. Something I noticed as I came to better understand earning money on YouTube was that videos that include mockery, stoke internet flame wars, or create overly inflated moral outrage against a specific person or group are definitely the most profitable for tons of creators on the platform across genres. They're easy to make, they drive tons of engagement, and somehow give the viewer the impression that the creator making the video is some kind of moral beacon, a white knight who crusades against evil, and that tends to drive donations. This strategy, provoking outrage for profit, is how many popular social commentators and even politicians really make their living, and it's incredibly harmful. Once I understood that, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could stir outrage in my audience, severely hurt this discourse, and make enough money to do something crazy like buy a house in Austin, Texas. Or I could stick to my original goals of making helpful, informative videos and be content with the money I could make ethically. I did my best to choose the latter course of action. Being morally accountable as a content creator is an ongoing process, of course, and biblical values which I was taught as a kid have become all the more precious to me considering. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. One cannot serve God and money. Of course, I don't actually believe in the existence of gods, so when I read this, I take it more as one cannot conduct oneself ethically while making money their highest priority. Further, Jesus' parable about the Good Samaritan is deeply meaningful to me as a lesson on not letting one's own tribalism get in the way of caring for others in need. His charge to care for the poor, even at the expense of the rich, is an idea which I carry into my politics. Moral lessons which I originally learned as a child through the teachings of Jesus still greatly impact my thoughts and actions today. Certain careful viewers of mine have noticed this and left comments asking a valid question. Why then, Drew, don't you consider yourself a Christian? This comment isn't meant to ask why I don't believe in the supernatural elements of Christianity. If you're interested in hearing about that, I do have other videos addressing that. The question asks, rather, why I don't consider myself a follower of Jesus, the man, given that I hold dear many of his teachings, as well as those from the Hebrew wisdom literature which he so often drew upon. It's a good question, and one which I've given a great deal of thought, especially in light of my recent trip. Here, I'll attempt to answer it, giving a few reasons I don't follow Jesus, even though I still deeply cherish certain stories and ideas attributed to him. Now, if we're talking about the historical man Jesus here, I must conceptualize him as credible historians do. An inextricable feature of Jesus' character was his preaching of apocalypticism. This was the view that evil spiritual forces such as demons and principalities had taken over the world, causing all the suffering we experience and all the wrongdoing humans commit. Any day now, though, God was to come to earth, drive out these evil forces, judge the righteous and unrighteous, and establish his utopian kingdom on earth. Keep this in mind as I'll reference this idea throughout the video. Evil forces are not to blame. The first reason I'll give for not following Jesus is that I don't believe that suffering or wrongdoing are a result of evil, much less spiritual forces. Behind all experiences which we'd call suffering is a nervous system. This is just a part of our biology which evolved to help us survive. Damaging various body parts, breaking social ties, and losing members of our tribe can lessen our chances of survival, so organisms which reacted in ways which caused them to avoid these things were naturally selected for. We are the descendants of these organisms. Suffering is little more than an evolved response to a universe indifferent to us. It's not a result of evil or an intentional spiritual attack. I don't think spiritual forces must be invoked to explain actions we'd consider wrong, either. Humans are perfectly capable of harming others on their own, but even still, I don't consider such actions evil or a result of a corrupted, immoral nature. People don't do harmful things just for the sake of harming others, but rather because they're in desperate need, ignorant of the consequences, fearful and defensive, or neurochemically imbalanced. Willful evil, whether it invokes spiritual beings or not, is a primitive myth that oversimplifies the complex psychosocial process behind antisocial behavior. For this reason, I strongly oppose retributive justice. Simply punishing those who harm others just creates more harm and doesn't address the actual root of the problem. This is the kind of justice which Jesus' teaching, whether taken as apocalyptic or not, invokes. In this view, wrongdoing comes from the corruption of one's nature, so justice can only be done if the wicked, the corrupt, are destroyed. Rehabilitation and restoration by natural means are therefore impossible. In my opinion, this view has caused one of the most significant injustices of our time, the mass incarceration of criminals entirely capable of rehabilitation. Millions of lives are destroyed because we refuse to put away the myth of willful evil. Regardless of the mercy and forgiveness he displays, Jesus' teaching rests firmly upon this ignorant view, and I simply cannot follow a person who teaches it. Apocalypticism and post-death reward impedes social progress. In order to refute the idea that Jesus was a perfect moral teacher, non-Christians will sometimes point out Jesus' toleration rather than disavowal of slavery. In the Gospels, he tells several parables that mention slaves, yet never in his ministry did he ever say that one should not own another human as property. As it's usually intended, I think this criticism is valid. However, when we recognize Jesus as the apocalyptic preacher he actually was, his morals make a bit more sense. Absolutely crucial to his message was the idea that the world as we knew it was about to end. What would be the point in calling for any restructuring of social hierarchies if God was about to just overthrow all human governance anyway? On this view, it only makes sense to encourage people to do that which will win them favor with their soon-to-be ruler, Yahweh. Whether slave or free, rich or poor, your highest priority shouldn't be improving this world, but gaining admission into the world to come. Since the world didn't end and we have no tangible evidence for another realm of existence where ultimate justice is done, Jesus' moral teachings are woefully inadequate to address injustice and suffering in the real world. Selling all your possessions and giving the money to the poor is an incredible act of kindness, but it doesn't get us closer to long-term solutions to poverty. In order to find such solutions to poverty, disease, and social injustice, we must think long-term with the assumption that if we don't solve these problems ourselves, they will persist. Counting on something or someone else to solve our problems one day will only prolong our suffering. Various versions of the view that ultimate justice will be done at the end of time or at the end of our lives has actually served as a useful tool for oppressors for centuries. Don't worry about suffering now, rulers tell the oppressed, because God will give you peace in the afterlife. Or as one of my favorite artists, the father of Afrobeat, Fela Kuti, put it in his song Suffering and Smiling.
Suffer, suffer for world, enjoy for heaven, Christians go the yab.
And the reason why Islam and Christianity is spread all over Africa, we know, is to exploit the people. All Christians think like white, like European, like English and Americans, and all Muslim people think like Arabs. So they're just diverting the African minds from their roots, that's all,
This mentality prevents people from rising up and finding solutions to their problems, which is convenient to an oppressive ruling class. Personally, I can't follow a teacher who assumes that justice will be done regardless of human action, when it's clear that only human action has ever solved human problems. Okay, at this point, you might ask, why don't you consider yourself Christian in a looser sense? Lots of Christians already don't strongly believe in the supernatural parts of Christianity and still follow a more idealized Jesus rather than the historical Jesus. If you like Christian stuff so much, why not just join their ranks? That's tougher to answer, but I'll give it a try. Narrative and identity above all else. Stories are excellent ways to teach moral lessons, as they're more captivating, emotive, and memorable than any alternative. As I said earlier, I learned many of the moral values I still cherish today by learning biblical stories. Now that I'm an adult and can reason for myself, though, I don't maintain those morals because I cherish those stories. I have deeper reasons for my moral values, which I came to on my own. In fact, the reasoning I've done on my own, moral and otherwise, has led me to stop cherishing many Christian stories. Jesus working miracles to show his power, his teachings about marriage, and his apocalyptic parables are a few examples. I've observed a pattern among religious people, conservative and liberal, traditional and progressive. Say someone develops a new value, like pacifism, vegetarianism, or affirmation of non-traditional gender identities. They then contextualize their new value within their religious view, saying that their new value naturally stems from their pre-existing religion. If a Christian, they might say, Jesus was a pacifist, or Jesus taught us to be compassionate, and I think that he would extend that to animals too. Or Jesus said that we should love everyone, no matter what, so that means affirming queerness. I don't think this is necessarily a problem, and I wouldn't care to argue with someone who believes that their religion supports ideas I hold myself. However, I don't think that this contextualization, at least for myself, is necessary at all. Why must we tie our values to our cherished stories so closely that we reinterpret those stories when we come to believe something new, effectively treating our cherished stories as if they're as morally relevant as our values themselves? Well, I can think of one reason to do this: maintaining one's group identity or tradition. Again, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do think a lot of people get so caught up in protecting their group's stories, identity, and traditions that their values become secondary. When that happens, our tribal minds usually slide, without us really noticing, into thinking in-group good, out-group bad. That is a problem. It's an overly simplistic, self-centered view which serves as the basis for most human conflict. For that reason, I'm extremely cautious with anything that might make my thinking more tribal. I greatly admire the teachings of the Buddha and live almost according to his eightfold path, incidentally. My favorite Greek philosopher is Epicurus, and ever since I discovered him as a teenager, I've sought to live a tranquil, well-analyzed life free of unnecessary desires, as he taught. I love the work of Carl Sagan, greatly value the scientific skepticism he taught, and have even shared his teachings in several videos on this channel. But I don't call myself a Buddhist, an Epicurean, or a Saganist, as I'm wary of falling into a similar pattern of tribal thought once these labels become so attached to my identity. Besides, I personally get all that I feel I need from these figures' teachings without wearing them as an identifying label. I wouldn't want to say that I'm a follower of Christ, affixing that to my identity, and then slowly come to place greater value on the story of Christ than on the moral values he taught, which are defensible in their own right. And, to be perfectly honest here, maybe I wouldn't be so concerned about this happening were I to identify as Christian specifically if I hadn't seen it happen so often in others. That may very well be a product of my experience and environment, where Christian practice often creates highly insulated groups in which unchecked tribalism gives rise to antisocial attitudes and behaviors toward the outgroup. I mean, I grew up in the American South, so I think you know what I'm talking about. If I lived in a part of the world where Christianity wasn't linked so closely to radicalization, perhaps I'd be more comfortable wearing the Christian label in some limited cultural sense. Even with that comfort, though, I'm not sure if I'd really feel the need to do so. So, because I personally find it pointless to contextualize my values through the teachings of Jesus, and I see many people doing so in order to preserve their group identity, something I'm wary of, I can't call myself a Christian. I'm perfectly content to love Jesus because I first appreciate his morals rather than following his morals because I first loved Jesus. I want to hear what you guys think, though, especially those of you who identify as Christian in the non-theological sense I discussed here. What benefits do you get out of being a sort of non-believing Christian? Do you worry about tribalism? If so, how do you navigate that? Am I being overly cautious because of the Christian extremism in my specific part of the world? Let me know in the comments. Identity is a touchy thing to discuss, especially among strangers on the internet, so try to engage other commenters with patience and empathy. It's what Jesus would do. Not to say that that's the reason you should actually do it. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, like I said, and until next time, stay skeptical.